Here to speak with us, I believe, is Lynn Stuart Parramore. Lynn is one of my favorite writers. She's become one of my favorite writers on economic issues. She is a cultural theorist and senior editor at AlterNet, where she directs the new Economic Dialogue project. She writes about culture and economics for Reuters, the Huffington Post, and a bunch of other venues. And I think I found this piece in Al Jazeera, if I'm not mistaken. It was entitled "Love in the Time of Inequality. Could Love Be Capitalism's Next Casualty?" Lynn, thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, pleasure to be here with you today.
Well, listen, this was a great piece, as so many of your pieces are. I got a lot out of it. And, it's one of those things where sometimes your best pieces, or the pieces I respond best to, at least, are the ones where I thought, yeah, I was kind of thinking about that in the back of my mind, but didn't have a language for it, and you really put that together really well. And basically, I don't want to, misstate your thesis completely, but basically, I think what you're saying is that as global wealth inequality increases, it becomes harder and harder for people, first of all, to marry outside their economic class, which used to, and secondly, for people even to live the kind of life that's conducive to happy love relationships and marriages. Is that a fair summary?
Right. Yes, that's right. There's a sense in which love, the kind of love that we associate with long-lasting commitments, becomes a luxury when there is widespread economic hardship and the concentration of wealth is making more and more people's lives insecure, and they're dealing with chronic job instability and all kinds of stresses. You could almost think of the prosperous post-war period in America as sort of the heyday of romance, and this idea that marriage was about finding a romantic partner, someone who would with whom you would achieve some kind of long-lasting fulfillment, both independently and mutually. And the fact of the matter is, when you are at the lower end of the economic ladder, that's not really possible. You don't have the leisure time, you don't have the resources to invest in that kind of commitment. And women, for example, poor and working class women, we're finding that they are in many cases choosing not to marry, not to form long-lasting partnerships with men, because the men in their cohorts are more likely to be out of a job, or if they do find a job, to have something that's very precarious. And so these women are deciding instead to invest in themselves and their own skills and education, and bring up their children independently of a husband or a long-term relationship. And that's a trend that's been steadily growing since the late 80s.
Well, that brings up so many thoughts for me, including I tend to look at things through the lens of music as a reflection of culture. And in the 50s, I grew up, I was very little in the 50s, but in the 50s and 60s, which have turned out to be something of a heyday, at least in modern times, for marriage and love, there was a big body of songs about marrying outside your social class, poor side of town and down in the boondocks, and Roy Orbison working for the man. I mean, there was this whole, pick me up on your way down in country western music. There was this all, well, you think you're, but it was all about, well, I'm just a poor boy, and, but I dare love you, or the reverse of that. And it seems to me now we need a new music body of music to cover the fact that love. The other thing that strikes me.
We're going to our chapel and you're going to yours.
Right.
Economic apartheid that is beginning to settle in America, and it's creating very different social and cultural paths for people depending on what their income level and resources are.
Yeah, and it's also, it's exactly, and it's tempting to be flippant and say, that commitment-averse man or woman can now say, I'm sorry, darling, but the Gini coefficient is too high, and, But the fact is that, underlying all of this is, it's kind of heartbreaking stuff, isn't it?
Oh, it really is, because the human values that we associate with long-lasting love, things like loyalty and devotion and altruism, those things tend to get crowded out under stressful economic conditions, and people have to make pragmatic decisions. It's not that, for example, poor and working class women don't want love. It's just that they have to be pragmatic about the choices that they're making and decide, okay, how am I going to best use the meager resources that I have to have a family? Maybe I'm going to just invest those in raising children on my own rather than take on a husband who might end up being another mouth to feed. And there's June Carbone and Naomi Kahn, who have a new book out called Marriage Markets, make the point that in the legal system, our divorce laws are really set up for the advantage of people at the upper end of the economic ladder, and that when you're sort of in the middle, the median income or below, divorce laws are not particularly favorable, especially to women, and so they look at marriage as a fairly risky thing. It's contrary to what we imagine, that marriage is supposed to be this thing that makes life secure, but many of these women are looking at it far differently, and they're sort of looking around in their social world and seeing how many divorces occur and the problems that ensue, and they're just choosing, to forego it altogether.
Well, and so you have a situation, it's almost Dickensian in a way, where, or I think of, Victor Hugo or somebody, these classics of literature where young lovers are thwarted by poverty and social conditions and social limitations and class. We think of that as a 19th century relic, but what you're really saying here, and what these studies are suggesting, is that kind of tragedy, economically based emotional tragedy, is coming back, and we have a political class that idealizes the family. We have a pop culture that idealizes lasting love, but everlasting love, but we have economic policies that decimate both of those things, it sounds like.
Absolutely, and it's interesting when you look at, the what you might think of as the red states, the more conservative states. Lower income people in those states are, more likely to be evangelicals, for example. And the evangelical churches still preach this, the commitment to long-lasting marriage and partnership is a duty that's it's not just about your personal fulfillment, but it's about your duty to God. And unfortunately, so many of the people who are hearing that message simply can't afford to do it. So there's this real cultural disconnect between the values that are being espoused in the community or reflected in pop culture, et cetera, and what's really going on. Although it's really interesting, when I was a kid in the 1970s, the soap operas were such a big deal in the afternoon. It was all about love in the afternoon, and those shows were marketed towards middle class, working class, poor, even families and women in particular. If you turn on a soap opera today, the audience for them has shrunk dramatically, but they're no longer really about love in the afternoon. They're about hookups and casual sex. You really don't see people making the commitment to long-term partnerships or even buying into the idea of romance the way you did, 20, 30 years ago. It's really fascinating to see how these cultural products are reflecting the changes in the larger society. And even among, college students at the more elite schools, you hear about this hookup culture developing because, unless you are very rich and your parents have a lot of resources, you have to be careful about who you're going to make a long-lasting commitment to. And so a lot of young people are like, oh, we're going to wait a few years after college to decide to, see how the job situation sorts out, and we're not going to make those kinds of commitments in college, so we're just going to hook up, have casual, brief encounters, relationships, and, be very careful about walking into a long-term commitment.
Well, it really is fascinating, and does suggest that so much of what goes on around us in our cultural and emotional lives is driven by economics. And you talk in the piece about the work of Jeremy Greenwood, macroeconomist, talking about assortative mating and how much less likely it is now for someone to marry outside their social class. So the poor remain poor by marrying in kind, as you write, and the rich seal their dynastic unions as they attend Ivy League colleges together as legacies or enjoy exclusive fetes at the White House. I did a piece for Salon on these dreadful human beings, actually. One was a Mellon, heir to the Mellon fortune, and the other was his wife, who've created a website about their lifestyle and how to spend $16,000 on a desk shaped like a dolphin and all that stuff.
Sure. Real Gilded Age stuff.
Oh, it's unbelievable. And so, I mean, another song from my youth, only in America can a poor boy like me grow up and marry a rich girl like you. Jay and the Americans.
Ain't happening today.
Ain't happening.
It ain't happening. And you think about Mad Men, a show like that, where the executive is going to marry the secretary. That's just not very likely to happen now. The marrying outside the caste, the assortative mating, that's a trend that's been on the rise. And it all sort of starts in the late 1980s. That's when you can really see the divergence happening with most of these trends that we're talking about today.
Well, it's late 1980s, so at the end of the Reagan era, and boy, I'll tell you, one of the things I got from your piece so strongly, and it's a foundational thesis of this show, basically, is that a lot of what's happening is driven. Follow the money, follow your heart, follow the money.
And if you think what's happening at the lower end of the economic ladder isn't relevant to you, just wait a few years. These forces that are impacting love and marriage, among the working class, that's creeping up into the middle class. And more people in the middle class are going to be dealing with the same stressors and chronic instability and having to make the same kinds of, more pragmatic decisions and economic decisions about things like marriage and long-lasting partnerships.
Well, and sadly, we're going to have to leave it there with another reminder of the great old Harlan Howard song, Pick Me Up on Your Way Down. Lynn Parramore, thanks so much for being with us, and thanks for all the great writing.
Thank you for having me.